Well, it's with great pleasure I have to introduce you to John Brown, who's going to tell us today about the Secret Orlando, which I assume after today it won't be a secret anymore. So, John Brown really needs no introduction because you see him every evening because he's the Fox 35 evening newscaster. And he's also a nationally recognized TV journalist, public speaker, radio talk show host, and an author of nearly a dozen books. And besides that, he's an inventor. So he's a man of many talents. He's also an Emmy Award winner and a recipient of the Literacy Medal for historical writing, named Best Large Market News Anchor, and that was presented to him by the Missouri News Broadcasters. Besides many other things, he graduated from Central Methodist University, and he got a degree in biology, and he was with a minor in chemistry and was prepared to be a medical doctor, but he got involved in his passion of news and history and became a newscaster instead. He's married, has 2 daughters, and he also was very active, a marathon runner, and he self-proclaimed a fair weather golfer. And when he's not doing that, he's again studying history. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you, John, and give him a great Rotary welcome.
Yeah, very quickly, backstory here. So my degree is in biology and chemistry, and you say, how'd you end up in broadcasting? Well, I was about to go to medical school back in 1994 when we had the first debate about socialized medicine. So I was working, my stepfather's a doctor, old Florida guy. And so everybody said, don't go right now. Take a couple of years off and see what happens. So I ran off to South Beach. And after a few, thanks to prohibition being ended, there was no way I was going back to medical school after that because I'd forgotten everything I ever learned. So that was never going to happen. Another background here very quickly. The challenge for me when it comes to talking about history in a group like this is a lot of you guys know the Orlando history, so it's a challenge. And as I always say, you don't really care about history until you're almost history. And that's when it actually starts to matter to you. And so I've already heard tons of history stories here, but I also have an old Florida family in history here, the Roberts family. My stepfather was the doctor, grew up in Central Florida, went to Florida even before you did. And so the Roberts family, B.K. Roberts Law up in Florida State, that's part of the family. And then also Fireball Roberts. Some of you guys who grew up around here remember the name Fireball Roberts, won the Daytona 500, grew up in Tavares. But here's an interesting thing about him. His nickname, Fireball. If you don't know how he died in a crash in what, the 600, one of the races, 600, like the 7th lap, died in a crash. Well, he had his nickname a long time before that. He was a great baseball pitcher. And they called him Fireball. And so from a young age, I heard this story growing up my whole life. So from a young age, I always realized you don't want to have your nickname in a way that you might die. It's a good piece of advice that you, and the family all recognizes that. But probably when they named him Fireball and he became a race car driver, probably should have changed the nickname because that wasn't exactly the best choice from there. Okay, so what I do in the evening news is I get to go out and I get to experience all the things around Central Florida, which is a blast. When I do these stories, though, as you see on TV, you only get about a minute and a half to do those stories because the research shows that people start to tune out after about a minute and a half or 2 minutes. So I do these stories, I go to all these cool places, and I think, what am I going to do with the rest of this material? Well, that's what happens with my books. So it's a little bit history, it's a little bit travel and tourism, a little bit Convention and Visitors Bureau. Bill Pieper, he's here, he can correct me on some things as well. And so it's all that together. And my job, as I always say, is to get people interested and excited about our history here. And if they want to learn more, they can do a deep dive because there are tons of books out there that are all about our history here. But my job is to get people excited. And the first thing that I point out with this book, Secret Orlando, which, by the way, is #1 on Amazon right now, regional travel and tourism book, so it's doing okay. But there's a problem with this book right off the bat, and you can see it right up there. It's in purple. Secret Orlando. The name is completely wrong because, as far as I'm concerned, it should have been called Secret Jernigan. As we all know, the original name of the Orlando area is Jernigan, named after Aaron Jernigan. Came here way back in the 1840s, set up an outpost, and all of a sudden he had a town. They called it Jernigan. And so the area started being known as that. It started growing a little bit. And so they decided to change the name. But here's the problem. Nobody knows why we changed the name. There are 4 theories, but none of them go down in the history books as the actual reason why we changed it from Jernigan to Orlando. And here are those 4 theories. And I'm going to dispel all of these, okay? The biggest, most widely known story of the name change back in 1856 was Judge James Spear. He helped Orlando become the county seat. He was the man back then, right? Judge James Spear was the guy, kind of like a Buddy Dyer, only bigger. Whatever he said kind of went. And I know Buddy's a member here as well, so I had to mention him. So Judge James Spear, it said that he not only helped bring the county seat here, but they named Orlando after a man who once worked for him. But if you look back in history, you realize there's no way that can happen because Judge James Spear was a larger than life, big ego guy. So for him to name a town after someone who worked for him, that's never going to happen. So throw that one out. Number one's gone. Number two, Spear named the city after a character from Shakespeare's As You Like It. Now, if you look back in history, you realize that Judge James Spear did like Shakespeare. And there is a character called Orlando in that play. But again, why? So I throw that one out. That one makes no sense to me either. Number three, Mr. Orlando, the guy who worked for Judge James Spear, was on his way to Tampa when he died, and he was buried nearby. And the locals would walk by and say, "There lies Orlando." That one's just stupid. But it's out there, so I feel like I need to point it out. And then number four, this one may make the most sense, is there's a sentinel named Orlando Reeves. We're talking back in the Seminole Indian Wars, all right? Well, he was killed in that in a raid there, and he was buried in the area known as Sandy Beach. Now, another thing that if you are longtime locals here, you know we like to change names in Florida. We'll go with something for a while and decide, nah, it's not so good. Let's change it. So we do that quite often. I mean, think the beeline to beach line, right? That's confusing. And they sound the same. That one always confuses me. So we change names with a lot of things. So the reason why this one's a little confusing is, like I said, Orlando Reeves was buried by Sandy Beach. That's what Sandy Beach was right there. It was on some property owned by Jacob Sutherland, or Summerlin rather. It was his farm and ranch. When he bought the property way back in the 1870s, he realized that there was a bit of a sinkhole going on out there, right? So he bought this land and the land's starting to sink. And so that's what it ended up looking like. He had the sinkhole. He decided he was going to name it something. So he named the sinkhole Sandy Beach. So downtown Orlando starts growing. He decides to open up Sandy Beach so the locals who were living here had a place to go and cool off. Okay? So they would come here, and that's an image from way back then. You can see that's what downtown Orlando looked like back then. And so then his son was Judge Robert Summerlin, also became the mayor of Orlando. Well, he decided to change the name of this sinkhole. And this is important. He changed the name of the sinkhole on his parents' property to Lake Eola. Think about this for just a second. So our iconic thing in downtown Orlando is a sinkhole. We send out postcards, we send out pictures, we have videos. The backdrop of me on the news is a sinkhole that we decided to name, then change the name to Lake Eola, named after his fiance, the judge's fiance, who died just before they got married. So again, that's the kind of stories that I like uncovering because a lot of people here don't know our history. You don't know this, we have the lowest percentage of people who live in our town who didn't grow up here. Only about 32% of people who live in the metro area here actually grew up in the Orlando area. Not many. So people don't know about our history. They don't know about these strange changes that happened over time. And they don't know about our pineapple industry. And this one fascinated me. Way back in time, we were the Pineapple Express. If you got a pineapple over in England around this era, it was a delicacy and it likely came from here and it was expensive. You had to be really somebody in Europe to get a pineapple from Orlando. So we found out that our climate was great. The land was great. And you can see the picture on top right there. That's one of the biggest pineapple farms in the world at that point. It was owned by a guy named, last name, Russell. That'll come into play in just a bit. So that's his land. So think about this. If you're driving north on I-4, which is the map below, you're driving north on I-4 and you see Lake Ivanhoe. Lake Ivanhoe is on your right. And by the way, when I ever run for office, I have two platforms. See, I don't use notes, so my stream of conscious thinking gets going. I have two platforms. One, I'm getting rid of daylight savings time. Doesn't need to be here anymore, right? You're going to vote. Okay. Campaign donations in the back after this. Thank you. And number two, I'm changing I-4 to north and south. I know why it's east and west. I understand the Department of Transportation, but look at this. You're going north-south. So when you tell people, oh, go west on I-4, and they're like, I don't know where to go. Which one goes west? So anyway, that's my platform. I appreciate your support in about 4 years. Okay, so that area, as you're going north, and you got the western on your right-hand side, that's where Russell lived. That was his original house. All that land around there, around Lake Ivanhoe, all that area was his farm. So here's the problem with this one. About the time his pineapple business starts really booming, Orlando's doing great with this. We're shipping them out. The country of Cuba finds out that they have an even better climate and even better soil to grow pineapples. So they took our industry. So this guy named Russell decides, I'm going to beat Walt Disney to the punch. And you got to think back in time here, okay? I'm going to take you way back in time. This was a time when parents didn't like their kids. It's true. Think about it. Who had a car seat here growing up? No, you didn't have a car seat. Right? You have all these stories. Parents didn't like their kids back then. And how do I know this? Because Mr. Russell decided to invent Orlando's first theme park, which was named Joyland. Right? This was in business from 1910 to around 1919, 1920. The guy's named George Russell. He had the toboggan chute. And why do I say that parents didn't like their kids? Because he had a water park just outside of Orlando in the middle of a swamp, alligators, snakes, everything else. And parents said, let's go play. And took the kids out there to play and slide down the toboggan. Now, behind that picture you see right there, that's what became downtown Orlando. As you can see how rugged it still was around this time. So again, parents didn't like their kids. And at some point, probably a few alligator bites, maybe a few snake bites, he decides, I'm getting rid of this too. So he transitions into 1920, starts selling off his land. That land became College Park. That land became the Lake Ivanhoe district. All of that was his fields. So when you go into that area right now, you're starting to see more and more pineapples pop up, okay? You go to the Pinery. If you guys haven't been to the Pinery yet, spectacular restaurant. And if you go inside, it's all the history of our pineapple industry here. All these pictures on the wall. It's wonderful. And then one of our top 10 restaurants each and every year, according to Travel Advisor, Russell's. That's the name Russell that owned the land. So when you see Russell with the pineapple on top, it now makes sense. Russell was the guy who owned the land where this restaurant now is. So I also started talking to people who were painting pineapples on buildings and people who had pineapples on buildings. And I said, do you know why you have a pineapple on your building? Most had no idea. So it showed me that they don't really know their history. But if you go into that area right now and you say, you know what, I see a pineapple right there on your doorstep. I want to learn more about it. They probably know their history. They'll warmly welcome you in and say, come on, let's talk about it. However, in my research, I also found that if you go to the villages and you see a pineapple on somebody's front porch, do not ask about it because they will also invite you in warmly and invite you to stay a while. So if you don't know that story, you haven't been watching enough news lately. So you can Google that one afterwards. So the pineapples. Here and the villages, two different stories. All right, next up here. Again, I love finding these hidden things. And since you guys all work downtown, you probably know the history of this one. Most people don't. Beecham Theater, built in 1921. It was the place. You think about the golden era of vaudeville, you're getting silent films, you have all this going on. Braxton Beecham, who became a mayor, built the Beecham Theater in 1921. And at this point, if you were one of the stars, you likely came through here. Big stars came through downtown Orlando. You can see Marx. They had one of his debuts here. It was a big deal. People would line up and crowd Orange Avenue to get into the Beecham Theater. Well, around the same time, a man named Joseph Ange, A-N-G-E, he decided he was going to build a hotel because now we have all these celebrities coming here. We have nowhere for the celebrities to stay. So right across the street, he built the Ange-Built Hotel. And you know it's still the Ange-Built Hotel because if you walk by it, the A's are still on the outside of the building. Now it's mixed use. There's a bar on the first floor. And it has all the old stuff from the hotel. And the people who work there don't really know why it's there. They don't realize that this was such an iconic structure. So the rumor around downtown is there a tunnel that connects the Beecham Theater with the Ange-Built Hotel? And why would there be? Well, the old story has been when the stars came to town, if you think about it, this was the big publicity era. People would flock. So you didn't want these stars walking across from the Ange-Built over to the Beecham, they would get mobbed. And so the theory is that there's a tunnel that goes from underground over. There's a trapdoor at the back of the Ange-Built. There's a trapdoor at the back of the Beecham, and there's a tunnel underneath so the stars could go by undetected. So is it true? Partially true. And here's what it is now. By the way, this is what it looks like today. You can see how close they are in proximity. You have the Ange-Built Hotel on the right there, the Beecham, which isn't quite what it was back then. It's on the left. So there's a tunnel underneath. And in fact, there is a tunnel. A TV crew recently got under there, and this is what it looks like. But here's the problem as well. In the middle, under Orange Avenue, it's not tall enough for you to walk through. It's big enough on each side, so it does connect the two, it appears. There's still a trapdoor at the Beecham. They can't find the one that's attached to the Ange-Built, but it still runs under there. So this guy couldn't walk through there. He had to crawl through. So why would there be a tunnel? Well, I appreciate whoever brought up Prohibition earlier in the show because that's probably the answer. When this started, yes, you had the stars at the Ange-Built and they were performing over there. They wouldn't go through, but their alcohol needed to. So that may have been the way that they got the alcohol back and forth between the Angeville where they were staying over to the Beecham Theater. So you want the stars walking through there, but they had no trouble having the help go through there with all the alcohol. So anyway, it still exists. It's still under there, but just not used very much. It's just nasty now. You'd never want to go down there, but it still exists right underneath the Orange Avenue. People drive it every day, have no idea. Next up, if you've ever been on this trail, you see these things in the middle of the woods up north, you say, what in the world is that? They're right off the Marjorie Harris Cross Florida Greenway. It looks like a scene out of Lost, like a civilization just disappeared. Well, it's not exactly that, but it's somewhat close. That was when they built the Cross Florida Barge Canal. And people don't realize that we wanted to cut Florida in two. Much like the Panama Canal, we were going to build a canal from the Big Bend area all the way over to Jacksonville. They started construction on this. That's why you see these big structures still out there in the woods. And here's the story of this one, which I think is just fascinating. So that's the map they had for the Cross Florida Barge Canal. They were going to start the construction again over on the west coast of Florida, cut across. It ended up becoming part of the Rodman Dam, the lakes up there, which now they're wanting to knock down the Rodman Dam. That's another news story that's getting more and more attention. And they were going to connect it all the way to the St. John's, all the way up to Jacksonville. This had gone on since the 1500s. People who had ships didn't like going around the point of Florida. They wanted to cut across. So finally, it became a works project. They set aside the money, millions and millions of dollars. Even back then, they started construction. You can see the bridges, the canal that was built. This is one of the small images there that I found of as they were building this thing. Well, then the economy started to get better. Interest waned, which you guys have been around Florida. You know the story here. We have a great idea. Let's start it. And then we lose interest. Let's throw some more money at it. New politicians get into office. Let's throw some more money at it. I like it. I don't like it. And it kind of goes away. This ended up being the most expensive public works project in American history that was never finished. Nixon finally killed it in 1971, said, that's enough of this. This is done. So that's when it stopped. But on the right-hand side, you can still see, if you ever walk that trail up there, that's what's still out in those woods, these big, huge supports. But again, when I went up there one day, people had no idea what it even was. And I love going around and asking people, do you know what this piece of history is? And finding out how many people really know our amazing history here. Got my water real quick. Sorry if there's any feedback. On to the next history topic here. You guys know this one, right? I got a lot of old timers here. I got to learn to drink in the middle of my speeches. The number one question I get from all of our friends and family up north is, why is it when I fly into OIA, my bag tag says MCO, right? It makes no sense to people not from here, but there's actually a really cool history. And I got to interview one of the guys who used to fly with Mr. MCO. You see, way back in time, we were the Pine Castle Airfield here. Well, we brought in this guy named Colonel Michael McCoy. He was the original Tom Cruise from Top Gun. He was the guy. He came in here, and think about that era when he moved over here. You had Kennedy Space Center being developed. You had all these new airports being developed. Orlando was starting to grow. We were becoming a center for aerospace and technology. So Colonel Michael McCoy came in, and again, he was the guy. He was the one you would see as the spokesperson for all these great things happening here. Well, he's flying overhead one day in a Stratojet. And some of the people who knew him back then said he was kind of a hot dog when it came to aviation. He would push things a little bit too far. So he's flying over the area of College Park. People in College Park look up and they say, that thing's probably not supposed to be on fire, but it was. Apparently, he was pushing a Stratojet. They had sealed these records for 50 years, so no one knew what actually was the cause of the crash. Some blamed him, others blamed the jet. Some say he was pushing it too hard. He realized he was in trouble. He diverts his plane away from people and crashes it near John Young Parkway out in some woods. So he dies. But he was so revered in this area, they decided to rename Pine Castle Airfield in honor of him, McCoy Airfield. All right, so this was about the same time. When all this was happening, Disney was also looking at building his own airport here. We'll get to that in just a second. So it ends up becoming bigger and bigger. McCoy Field ends up becoming Orlando International Airport. But at that point, we already had the MCO on it. So the MCO stuck when we switched over to Orlando International Airport. So that's the story behind the MCO. And if you go over to the airport, McCoy's Restaurant, it's still there, great restaurant, that's named after him. So I couldn't do a secret Orlando talk without talking about Disney. And here's why it's so important. First of all, someone mentioned Mr. J.C. Penney. He's a Missouri guy. I've written about 12 Missouri history books. Walt Disney, in case you don't know, was also a Missouri guy. He grew up in the small town of Marceline, Missouri. And the old story is that he developed Main Street USA off of Marceline. And some people say that's probably not true, but he said at one point, Marceline had more of an impact on me than any other place I lived in my entire life. So there's probably some credence to that he did name or design Main Street USA after his hometown of Marceline. And some of his experts say that's what he thought in his mind Marceline looked like. We all flash back about what our hometowns look like. It's probably not reality. That may have been what happened here. So I had the chance to interview his friends, his family, his business associates there, all the people in Disney here. So I got to see a cool juxtaposition between how Disney was looked at up there where he was from versus down here when he became even a bigger star. Okay, so the one story we always ask, people ask me this one all the time, is there really, by the way, that clip right there on the left-hand side, in case you don't know, it was a female reporter who broke the story. It was still a big secret. No one knew that he was going to build. And a female reporter from the Orlando Sentinel is one that broke the story, put him on the spot. But it cracked me up when I saw the title on the paper, Girl Reporter Convinced by Walt Disney. Isn't that wild? I mean, that wasn't that long ago. Girl Reporter, she worked there, but she was the one who ended up breaking the story. Okay, is there a secret building in the castle? Do I have any Disney employees here, by the way? Okay, so here's what happens. Yes, there is a building. There is a nice little resort upstairs, way upstairs. This is where Walt Disney was going to stay when he came to town. He had designed it that way, although Walt, of course, died before the park was ever built. So this was where he was going to stay when he came to town. And you say, well, how do I stay there? Well, you don't. Because the theory or the word is, as soon as you ask, can I stay there? You don't get to stay there. It's kind of like wanting to join Augusta National Country Club where they have a Masters. If you ever ask to join Augusta, you never get to join Augusta. You have to be invited. That's kind of what this is. This is where the stars come to town, and it is spectacular. So it's a full suite up there. If you go around to the back side of the castle and you look up, you see 3 windows right there. Those are the windows in the sitting area right off the bedroom. This place is amazing. Tom Cruise stayed there when he brought his kids down here. I got to interview Christina Aguilera. She had just been up there. So I know it's there. We had a crew from our Tampa station get up there and get all this cool video. So yes, it does exist. This is where Walt was going to stay. And that's important because when Walt was coming to Orlando, he wanted to just go to his property. He didn't want to venture out. And so that leads into this part of the story. Walt wanted everything to be focused on here. And one thing people don't know about Walt Disney, or few do, is that he would study traffic patterns. He was a master at studying traffic. They said when he was younger, he would look at maps. He would study them all the time. That became vitally important later on. Because you see right there, people say, well, Walt used to have his own little runway, his own airport here. And you say, well, I've been to Disney so many times, I've never seen it. So here's what I'm going to show you on this map. When you're driving to Disney, so you're driving from the bottom there, that's going into Disney, and that's about the space where you're going to pay $50 for a cover charge to go in and spend $1,000 at Disney, right? I've never understood why they charge for parking. There's nowhere else you can go. You have to go into the park included in the charge of admission, right? But anyway, they distract you with the $50. A nice lady says, that'll be $50 to park here. So as you're looking this way, if you were to look to your right, there's a wooded area over there. And this time of year, you can actually see what's back there. There's a lot of construction equipment. There are backhoes. There's tractor trailers all parked on that land. So we zoom a little bit closer and you can start to see the runway on the right-hand side. It does still exist. I know this. I walked out there. I was kindly asked to leave. But on that runway, they have all this equipment that's out there, and that's what they use it for right now because they didn't need a runway anymore. But again, Walt Disney had wanted his own airport. And you can see at the top of that picture, that's what his terminal was going to be. And it actually operated for a while. If you see the view here, this is what it looked like about the time that they were really trying to get these short takeoff and landing fields. Any pilots here? Okay, right there. Okay, so you know all about it. Yes, you're an attorney for pilots. I know it all. I know very well. Okay, so that's what it used to look like. And at this point, one of the governors of Florida asked you, start saying, we want to stop all this traffic. We can't get between our major cities anymore. They wanted to create this network of short takeoff and landing fields where you could take little airplanes to all the towns around. And they operated for a while. So Disney did, in fact, have his own little airport there. The terminals at the very top, that's what the runway looked like. It did operate for a while because, again, Disney, when he came here, only wanted to come to Disney. Didn't want to venture out. He thought this would be a great way to get people here. So when they came here, they got to spend all of their money right on his property. Shawnee Airlines, you're exactly right. I saw the ad for it, and this operated in 15 or 20 different cities, right? Only held about 10 or 12 people, these small planes, and that's how they got people around. So how this all ties together, as I said, Disney was an expert in transportation. And the X on the map story more or less symbolizes that. So again, he was from Missouri. He didn't like what was happening in California. He was wedged in. Disneyland couldn't grow anymore. People owned the land all the way around. So he starts looking for someplace else to build his next theme park, Disneyland 2. He looked up at Niagara Falls. He looked outside of New York City, and he looked in St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis was the biggest town close to where he grew up. He always had an affinity for St. Louis. So he decides, he made the choice. He loved this area. Because if you look at St. Louis from a map back in that era, there are only two bridges practically to go across the Mississippi River. And every highway from east to west has to go across those two. You have the Poplar Street Bridge on the bottom and the Eads Bridge on the top. And there's a piece of land between there, and it was vacant. It knocked everything down. So Disney saw that and said, this is where I'm going to build my new theme park. He drew up the plans. A lot of people didn't realize they were also getting ready to build an arch nearby. That's all in the same area that Disney was looking. He was going to build his next theme park here. So in March of 1963, he comes to St. Louis to sign the deal. This is going to be his new theme park. He still wasn't exactly sold on St. Louis because he didn't like the weather. He wanted some place that could be open 12 months of the year. Although I doubt he'd been here in the summer to realize that was a mistake. So he picked St. Louis. He shows up to sign the plans. And August Busch stands up. Because also not far from where he's looking at St. Louis was the Anheuser-Busch Brewery. The Busch family controlled, and still to some extent controls St. Louis. So Disney is sitting at the table. He has one of the executives on each side. And Busch stands up and says, any man that's going to build a theme park in St. Louis and doesn't serve alcohol is a fool. Disney turns to the man on his right and says, we're never going to build here. It wasn't that Disney was opposed to alcohol. These were two billionaires who didn't like being told what to do. And here's one billionaire who kind of controlled the city, telling another billionaire who was controlling the entertainment industry, you're going to do what I say. So Disney said, put it on hold. It was a done deal for the city of St. Louis, but it got put on hold. So flash forward a few months later, he's looking around. He comes to Florida on November 21st, 1963. He's staying over in Tampa. So he drives up. He had family in Pearson. I believe his parents are buried in Pearson. So he knew this area. So he stayed in Tampa. He looked around in the area around Ocala. Wasn't quite sold. Looked around Daytona Beach. Wasn't quite sold. They go back over to the Tampa area. They look up and down along the coast, and he wasn't sold. You would think Tampa would be perfect, but they have a beach. And you think, well, how's that a problem? The beach is free. As I said, Disney wanted you to come to his property and have to spend your money on his property. If you came down here and you're staying with the kids and you say, let's do the beach instead today, it's free, he didn't like that idea. So that's why he squashed Tampa for a bit. Gets in his plane, November 22nd, 1963, takes off from Tampa, says, take me around by Orlando and Ocala once again. And he gets overhead and he sees the map that looks like this. He sees all these highways converging at one piece of land. And that's the X on the map story day, November 22nd, 1963. Says that's it. So we all know the story. It took a while to get the land, right? So the land he saw that day was the Dimitri property. The Dimitri family is still around. Many of you may know them. I've got to interview the Dimitri family numerous times. 12,400 acres is what they sold first. Of course, they didn't know it was Disney. They wanted rid of the land because it was a swamp. The only piece of land that was sometimes above the water, where the cows and everything else would go at times, that became Tom Sawyer Island, which is kind of cool. That was the only piece of property that was probably above land at that point, or above water, because it was so swampy. So he decides we're not going to land in Orlando and look at this because that would tip people off that maybe I'm looking here. So they keep flying. They get all the way to New Orleans. He gets off the plane and notices everybody's so somber. He asks somebody, apparently, he says, why is everybody so sad? And he says, Mr. Disney, haven't you heard? Mr. Kennedy was shot today in Dallas. So I bring that up because I think that's vitally important from a media standpoint, because on the exact same day that Kennedy was shot in Dallas was the exact same day that Disney chose Orlando. It changed our area forever, while the other changed our country forever. But more than that, all the attention from the media standpoint suddenly went to Dallas and Washington, D.C. for several months after. Disney was able to start this process without a lot of people paying attention. He was able to start compiling all this land under all the different names. We know all that story. So again, that's the date, November 22nd, 1963. We just had the anniversary of it, and they ended up having me on the air all over the country talking about this particular day and how it's such an odd moment in U.S. history and how it really changed so many things in one place. I'm going to leave you guys with this. I know you got to get back to work. This was the scariest story I wrote in the entire book. It's called the Mount Dora Catacombs. Some people call it the bunker. Other people call it the shelter. Now, the story is old downtown Mount Dora On the right-hand side, that's the old yacht club. If you're ever eaten at the restaurant over there, Pisces Rising, you see the yacht club out in front. It still exists. That's what it looked like back then. Okay, think about this era. Late 1950s, early 1960s, we're in the Cold War era. People are starting to build bomb shelters up north. And so apparently the group of people, the 25 wealthiest families in Mount Dora, start thinking, well, we should build something like that, except that we live in a swamp. So they started pooling their money. They needed a place big enough for all 25 families for 6 months. And in fact, they did start construction. And in fact, they ended up building this thing. And the reason why I was so scared of this story is because anybody I would talk to in Mount Dora would say, please don't write about this. Only a few dozen people apparently know where it is. I happen to find it. So I know it exists. That's the plans. 5,000 square feet underground in Mount Dora was where these families were going to hide if there ever was a nuclear war or a nuclear blast. They even went in. So again, it's all the movers and shakers in Mount Dora. You had the pharmacist, you had the doctor, you had pretty much everybody. And you can see right up there, that's the pharmacist squatting down. He had his pharmacy fully stocked underground. They had electricity run to this thing. They had fans making sure that the humidity was blown out. Families went in there. They had their entire weekend. They tried it out one weekend. And then the Cold War started to thaw, and they never went back in. But it does still exist. And this is what it looks like today. It is something out of a horror movie. You can see the wheelchair still sitting underground in Mount Dora. Again, the fan's been shut off for years, decades and decades. It's nasty down there now. The kids' toys are still right on the floor where the kids left them when they all left that weekend. You can see the common kitchen where they were all going to cook their own food. It's all just kind of dilapidated. And again, now it's not really that nice. So you say, how do you build a 5,000 square foot underground bunker in Mount Dora? Well, I can't tell you exactly where the piece of property is, but there's a place where some of the wealthier families in Mount Dora used to live, if you had lived in this area. And so back then, tennis courts behind your house were a big deal, right? So they apparently brought in construction crews from up north, stormed secrecy, excavated the whole area, and built this 5,000 square foot bunker in the backyard of one of the guys' houses, and told all the locals, we're building a tennis court. And I know this because I look back at Lake County actually keeps the records. There's one of those few counties who actually has the aerial images of the county from decade to decade to decade. You look at the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, it all looks the same. In the 60s, you're like, there's an entire orange grove missing here. So I was able to figure it out. And again, I started talking to some city leaders, and I was so worried about this story because there were so many people in Mount Dora who don't want this out. And I don't know why now, but I was nervous because I got emails from people in Mount Dora saying, please don't put this in your book. Okay, so Rotary Mount Dora booked me for my first speech. So the guy who booked me, I'm on the phone with him. He says, John, I want you to come out and talk about Secret Orlando. I said, have you seen my book? He said, no, I haven't seen it yet. I said, are there any of the 25 original families from Mount Dora as a part of your Rotary? He says, I don't think so. I said, okay, I'll come speak. So I give the talk. There's a gentleman sitting right here. I'm nervous. I'm sweating giving this talk because I know they want me to talk about it in Mount Dora. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And I'm looking over the crowd to see if anybody's eyes light up when I pull up that slide. This guy right here looks at me and starts shaking his head. I'm like, oh, this is about to get ugly. And so at the end of it, we had a lot more time. I said, are there any questions? Are there any questions? I'm trying not to look at that guy right over there because he's waving at me like it's like he won bingo. So finally, I'm like, yes. He says, I know the family where the bunker is built in their backyard. That guy was the pastor who buried that guy. So I said, I need to talk to you afterward. So we went back behind and I said, was everything I said kind of true? He said, yes, all of it's true. It still exists. It's there. I know. I did the funeral and the ceremony for the guy who lived there. And he said, please don't tell anybody where it is. So it exists. If you got an extra 3 hours, you can find it yourself. Because now if you look at the Google images, you can see the imprint, the ground's starting to settle, and there's a 5,000 square foot box in the backyard of one of these houses. I'm gonna leave you with this one, and this is very important because any UCF alum here, yeah, there we go. All right. The history of UCF, I think, is fascinating because people don't know. It was first known as Space University. You can see right there, it was to educate the students for jobs in space-age careers, right? This was the spot where NASA was going to send their people. It became Florida Tech in 1966, class began in 1968, and now became University of Central Florida in 1978. We are the second largest university in the country as of 2011. We have a Pulitzer Prize winner over there. We have an NFL quarterback. we have astronauts, and we have a crew currently working on the Starlink satellite system. Now, if you're not familiar with the Starlinks, we do these on the news all the time. The launches happen all the time. They're taking up these satellites. They're going to blanket the earth, they say, and you can have internet access anywhere. If you're in Africa, you want to get on the internet, the Starlink will help you do that. If you're in Antarctica, you want to get on the internet, you can get on there. They tell me, as a matter of fact, this is going to be so blanketed that you'll be able to pay for anything anywhere in the world. Fascinating. And you say, John, we can already do that. And I say, you absolutely can. You can run your credit card at the back of this room to buy a Secret Orlando book for anybody in your family for an upcoming holiday, all thanks to the technology at UCF. There you go. I'm out of time. Yeah, guys, the questions I do, I have questions. We have time for a couple.
Just a couple of our club notes. So Colonel Stanley Hand was the base commander at McCoy Air Force
Yep.
Base when it was sold to the city for $1, if I'm not mistaken. He's a longtime member of our club. And as was Jacob Summerlin, in my
You
understanding.
got all the history here. So same kind of story here, very quickly, you brought that up. So I was also McCoy. I'm like, okay, I know he wasn't gone that long. And at a speech I gave at Heathrow Country Club, that's where I met the guy who used to fly with him. And I said, was he really kind of this arrogant flyboy? He said, no. You said he was like this. He was like this. But he was the guy. I mean, he was the guy in Orlando at the center of our aviation industry. So he was a big deal back then. So that one was correct too. Yes.
Question. I
Yes.
know a fellow who wrote the book on going to St. Louis, then looking at Ocala.
Yep.
The horse farms on it,
Uh-huh.
and then out the plane window, saw where I-4 and the turnpike crossed.
Yep.
And he says that vacant land's where we're going. My question is, in the book, he says they were going to announce the next day that Walt Disney was building their indoor park at St. Louis, like you say.
Right.
But Walt and Roy were little in an alcove off the main room. August doesn't see him. He
Mhm.
comes in and announced to the group, wasn't at a podium, Walt Disney will sell Anheuser-Busch products at our theme park. And that's when Walt
Yeah.
leans to Roy and says, call the pilots. We're leaving at 10 in the morning. He said, wait a minute, the announcement's going to be 11. He said, we're going back to California.
Yeah, it is a fascinating story. And the Bush family, I mean, they were so powerful up there. But again, Disney, I think, was equally as powerful, not in that city, but boy, did it deal a blow to the city. Yeah, we got the arch, but now there's tons of vacant buildings in downtown. Plus, we have horrible weather there where I'm from.
How do you mention Secret Orlando without mentioning Billy Dow?
I don't have all day to talk. I've been incident a lot of cool stories from a historical standpoint.
Billy Dow was responsible for bringing Greenwich Martin Company, then at the Martin Marietta Corporation now, to Orlando, and as well as Disney.
Yeah, well, the cool thing is I had twice as much material as I needed, so I've got volume 2 already in the works. So, and again, it's not just our history. There's a lot of other places like the speakeasies in downtown, hidden places around town that you can go and find. So tons of stuff there. So
John, thanks a lot.
thank you. Great job. I'll do that. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming today.
All right.
So.
And a mug. Thank you. And I love coffee.
Years in Orlando.
Thank you, Chris.
We got a few historians. You might want to check some facts here. Oh, they were kind.